Well, let me tell you, the video shows President Barack Obama presenting his photo ID in order to vote. He was President of the United States. He was on the ballot. He was probably the best-known person in the entire world at the time. And even President Barack Obama had to prove who he was when he showed up to vote. Democrats are completely two-faced on this, Mr. President, because just recently, one of our Democrat colleagues, a senator from the state of Georgia, demanded voters show photo IDs if they wanted to attend one of his political rallies. So you need to show a photo ID to get in his rally, but you don't need to show a photo ID in order to vote. Oh, no. Two-faced, double standard, not common sense, out of touch with the American people. The mayor of New York City, and he is, of course, the face of today's Democrat Party, he is an avowed socialist. He admits it out loud. He told New Yorkers they wanted to help shovel snow in the city during the storm, you need to bring not one, but 2 forms of ID to prove who you were. Need an ID to get welfare, to attend a Democrat campaign rally in Georgia, or to shovel snow in New York City, you should absolutely need to show a photo ID if you want to vote in an election in America. Photo ID is a norm in democracies all around the world, Mr. President. All but one country in Europe requires a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. 36 states in America, including Wyoming, my home state, requires voters to present an ID when arriving at the polls. Can't be what Senator Schumer called fringe. It can't be a fringe to adopt a common practice in America, in 36 states, and around the world. That's what Chuck Schumer and the Democrats think is fringe. So why do Democrats continue to oppose the Save America Act? What is it that they're trying to protect? Yesterday, I spoke on this floor about the mess in the state of Oregon. Oregon hands out driver's license to illegal immigrants. Easy to get. In Oregon, a driver's license comes with automatic voter registration. You get a driver's license, you're of age, you're automatically registered to vote in the state of Oregon. As a result, from 2021 through 2024, hundreds of illegal immigrants were given driver's licenses and then automatically added onto Oregon's voter rolls. People are astonished when they hear this. Oregon is still scrambling to try to clean up the mess. When Americans hear stories like this, they lose faith in our elections and our system. The real voter suppression threat is not photo ID, but it's Americans losing trust in our elections. That's what we need to be concerned about, Mr. President. They lose trust when they learn that illegal immigrants are on the voter rolls, are being allowed to vote. Photo IDs restore the trust that our system needs. It reduces fraud, and it sends a simple message. It sends the message that your vote matters and that elections are decided by your fellow citizens, not by illegal immigrants. Democrats protect their own campaign rallies with ID requirements, yet they encourage voting without IDs. Why do our elections deserve any less scrutiny than Democrats' own campaign events? Not a single Democrat will come to this floor and explain that to the American people. Tell us why. That's what I would say to the Democrats. Come to the floor and tell us why you need a photo ID to get into your events, but you don't need one to vote. Every American should support elections that are fair, secure, and transparent. The Save America Act makes photo ID the law of the land, and it is the best way to ensure that our elections reflect the will of the American people. It is, by every measure, common sense. And that's exactly why every Democrat in this chamber voted against it. Now, Mr. President, on a separate matter, today the Department of Homeland Security remains closed. It has been shut down by the Democrats for over a month. The Democrats shut it down. Now they want to peel it apart and they refused to reopen it. Remember, the Department of Homeland Security was put into place after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 of 2001. It was established as a comprehensive program to protect our nation's security. The Democrats want to peel it apart. As they're playing their political games, people are suffering. We're seeing long lines, security lines at airports, thousands and thousands of TSA employees missing paychecks, and at the same time there have been multiple terrorist attacks on American soil. Here's what one Democrat member told Axios this week. He said, "We're making people hurt." Oh, I bet he's real proud of that. That's a Democrat answer. We're making people hurt. Apparently, this is what the Democrats want to pitch their voters on. We're making people hurt. It's much worse than that. The Democrats have blood on their hands. Today, Democrats have blood on their hands. Democrats continue to prioritize illegal immigrant criminals over American citizens. It's been going on a long time, and it continues today, and that's why they're holding hostage the Department of Homeland Security. I want every American to know why this is happening, because for more than a month, Republicans have tried to negotiate with Democrats, all aimed at reopening the Department of Homeland Security so we could have a secure America. But in spite of good faith efforts by the White House, and they've outlined and laid out a long offer, the Democrats continue to say, no, stay closed. The offer addresses mutual concerns in areas of cooperation. It includes IDs on the officers, body cameras. At the same time, the proposal protects the ability of law enforcement officers to uphold our immigration laws. Remember the laws that Biden ignored and had 10 million illegal immigrants flooded into our country over the 4 years that the Democrats were in charge here and Biden was in the White House, and the criminals that came with him? That's what the Democrats want to protect. Those are the people that the Democrats are focused on, the illegal immigrant criminals, rather than the safety and security of the American people. We come up with reasonable offers, and the Democrats have responded first with silence, then with spin, but not once have they come up with solutions. This is a basic betrayal and a blatant betrayal of the responsibility that all elected officials have to protect the American people. The Democrats are way off base. Let me tell you what this means. In Georgia, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which trains federal law enforcement officers in over 100 different agencies, it's shut down right now. In Nevada, a field office for the Homeland Security Investigation Unit that combats fentanyl and other drugs, it is unfunded. In Washington State, major upgrades for the Coast Guard at the Seattle Polar Security Cutter Home Port, they're on delay. None of this makes America stronger. None of this makes America safer. It makes America weaker. It is time to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security. The American people know that the Democrats are the ones standing in the way of their own personal safety. It's time for Democrats to get on board and fund the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Senate Minority Leader is recognized.
Well, Mr. President, Donald Trump promised an easy and quick war with Iran. He promised overwhelming victory. 3 weeks later in Iran, just the opposite of what Trump promised is happening. Last night, a stunning report in the Washington Post revealed that the Pentagon has reportedly discussed with the White House requesting $200 billion, $200 billion from Congress to bankroll Donald Trump's war with Iran. $200 billion so Donald Trump can go to war with Iran is preposterous, unacceptable. Even a fraction of that is unacceptable for a war without a plan, without a goal, without the support of the American people. Let's be very clear. If Trump wants $200 billion, that means he believes we might be in a war with Iran for a very, very long time. $200 billion is more than what we spent even at the height of the war in Iraq. It's more than we have spent altogether in Ukraine. It's an indefensible number, one of the most wasteful and unthought out budget requests I have ever heard in my time in the Senate. For $200 billion, we could lower health care premiums for tens of millions of Americans. For $200 billion, we could educate a generation and unleash the immense potential of our students. For $200 billion, we could cut hunger in this country in half or more for many years. For $200 billion, we could invest in jobs, in science, in manufacturing. We could begin fixing our power grid. But instead, the Trump administration reportedly wants $200 billion to go to war with Iran. It is unacceptable. It is ridiculous. It is beyond the pale. Such a large amount of money for a war that no one knows the goal, no one knows the conclusion, no one knows the path, that changes, Trump changes all of these things, the goal, the path, the cost, every day. And he wants us to spend all this money? And meanwhile, the consequences of Trump's war are mounting every hour. I hope America will look at this chart. In 4 weeks, gas prices have surged by 27% here at home. It is the second largest 4-week jump in 35 years, the second largest jump in 35 years. And Donald Trump doesn't care. Here's what Trump said about this huge increase, plus 27% in gas prices. He said, they're not bad. I thought it would be worse. Well, if you're a billionaire, you don't care. If you're a billionaire, you don't think such a large increase every time you pull up at the pump isn't bad. Tell that, Donald Trump, to the people paying $4 a gallon. And then look at what Kevin Hassett, Donald Trump's top economic advisor, said on live television. He said, Americans' pain is the least of our concerns. What an outrage. Hassett, take that back, because it sure is one of the biggest concerns of the American people. The least of our concerns right now? What kind of bubble are they living in when the average American has to figure out how to pay for gas to get to work or pay for lunch? America, every time you fill up the tank, know this. Donald Trump and his advisors don't care that you're hurting. It is the least of their concerns. They do not care that Trump's war is taking money out of your pocket. They do not care that rising gas prices are making it harder to pay rent, pay for groceries, pay for health care. They do not care. Shameful, disgraceful, cold-hearted, and so out of touch. But it doesn't stop there. This morning, Reuters reported that Donald Trump is thinking about deploying thousands more troops to the Middle East as the Pentagon prepares for the next stage of the war. You know what that sounds like to most Americans, what Trump said? It sounds like Trump is getting closer and closer to putting boots on the ground. It sounds like Donald Trump is thinking of expanding this war, mission creep on a massive scale. It seems like an oxymoron, mission creep on a massive scale, but they're creeping and creeping and creeping every day and bungling us into war. Boots on the ground, of course, will inevitably mean a surge in casualties, a surge in costs, a surge in chaos. That's not what the American people want, and Republicans know it. They know this war goes against the wishes of the American people, and they refuse, Republicans here in the Senate, refuse to stand up to Trump even though they know the war is wrong, wasteful, putting lives at risk. Last night, we gave Republicans another chance to assert Congress's constitutional authority to tell Donald Trump he cannot drag this country into war without authorization. Once again, Republicans opposed it when they opposed Senator Booker's motion. Where's their courage? Where's their loyalty to the Constitution? Where are the public hearings with Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth under oath? You want to spend $200 billion and you don't want to even let your cabinet people show up at hearings to answer questions? What an outrage. Americans' pain is the least of our concerns. You hear that, America? At $4 gas, Americans' pain is the least of our concerns. This is not the end of the matter in the Senate. This issue ain't going away. Republicans can try to wash their hands of Donald Trump's war with Iran, but they will not escape responsibility. The American people and Democrats will hold Republicans accountable for willingly supporting Donald Trump's reckless, aimless, chaotic war in Iran. On the SAVE Act, Republicans want to waste yet another day on a radical piece of legislation that hardly anyone outside the MAGA fringe even cares about, the SAVE Act. Democrats' position has not changed. If Republicans want to waste the Senate's time debating this bill, so be it. We will continue to debate it. That's what the rules allow the senators and Senator Thune to do. We'll continue, but we will continue to expose just how radical and ugly it is. That's what Democrats will do, over and over again. The longer the SAVE Act stays before the Senate, the more obvious it becomes it's not a voter ID bill, it's a voter suppression bill, it's a voter purge bill. The SAVE Act says no more vote by mail, no more driver's licenses to register, no registering online or on campus or at church. Republicans want to pass through the eye of a needle. Republicans want to make Americans pass through the eye of a needle just to exercise your fundamental right to vote. The SAVE Act would force every state in America to send its voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security, an agency that has nothing to do with administering elections and everything to do with Musk and Doge and incompetence at the top. Those voter rolls would then be screened by an algorithm designed by Musk and Doge to supposedly root out non-citizens from the rolls. But in reality, it could kick millions of American citizens off the voter rolls, just like it kicked off many American citizens when a screening was tested in Missouri. Now, MAGA Republicans keep talking about the SAVE Act in terms of protecting elections. This is a load of nonsense. Kristi Noem was more honest. She said it was about Kristi Noem said the SAVE Act was about making sure only the right people get to vote. The right people get to vote. So anyone who thinks this is just some benign effort to tell the small number of illegal immigrants, make sure they're not on the rolls, no one disagrees with that. Oh no, it's an effort to make the right people to get the vote. Who are the right people according to Republicans and Donald Trump? Well, the SAVE Act gives us some clues. Deep in the SAVE Act, there is one blanket exception for the SAVE Act's draconian restrictions. Only one. One exception. Guess what it is? It's for the state of North Dakota. North Dakota's ruby red. It's overwhelmingly Republican. and it's the only state that right now does not require any form of voter registration. So it gets a free pass from all the rules every other state would have to follow. How convenient. And look, MAGA claims of voter fraud are utter garbage, but according to the ultra-right Heritage Foundation, North Dakota had 12 instances of improper voting. 12's not a lot, it's tiny. But it was still more than other states that would be forced to impose draconian barriers to vote. North Dakota gets a pass again. How convenient. It's almost as if the goal of the SAVE Act has nothing to do with securing elections. This is how you write a bill designed to give Republicans a naked partisan advantage, and it is what the SAVE Act does. It's not a voter ID bill, it's a voter suppression bill. And finally, on TSA and ICE. Today, this afternoon, Democrats will be giving Republicans another chance to do the right thing by TSA workers and pay them for the important work they do, while we continue to debate how to address issues at ICE. Democrats have maintained the same position for weeks. We need to rein in ICE and stop the violence, and the American people are on our side. Rather than negotiate common sense reforms, Republicans have stonewalled funding, held critical agencies like TSA hostage. We Democrats don't want to do that. Republicans, we're willing to fund ICE now. Just don't stand in the way, support us, and TSA agents will be funded. Rather, we're willing to fund TSA now. Now. No ands, ifs, or buts. Last night, Warnock went to the floor to offer a UC to pay our TSA workers. For the fourth time, Republicans blocked the bill. Today, Senator Slotkin will try it again and give Republicans another chance to fund TSA right away, shorten the lines at the airport, and bring the chaos to an end. The only question Republicans must answer today is this: has enough been enough? Will they finally fund TSA or keep holding those workers and our travelers hostage? I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the House message with respect to S. 1383, which the clerk will report.
House message to accompany S. 1383, an act to establish the Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access and for other purposes.
Senator from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. President, this past weekend marked 61 years since President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered his "We Shall Overcome" speech to a joint session of Congress. Speaking from the House rostrum, in the wake of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, President Johnson urged Congress to pass legislation that would secure, quote, "the full blessings of American life to all, regardless of color or creed." That Congress would heed his call. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. That bill, nearly a century after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, would finally outlaw discriminatory practices that erected unjust barriers to voting for African Americans, like literacy tests, poll taxes. It would open the ballot box in America to everyone. 6 decades later, another president would speak from that same rostrum, this time at his State of the Union address. And that president insisted that Congress passed a bill that would make it more difficult, would make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. How far we have fallen from Lyndon B. Johnson's noble goal. We have not overcome. With this SAVE Act, we are still trapped in bigotry. Earlier this week, at President Trump's request, the Senate began consideration of the Save America Act in a marathon debate session. Why? Because President Trump is throwing a temper tantrum, demanding that Congress pass his legislation and nothing else. I have long said in politics there is always a good reason and a real reason. The good reason the president touts when arguing in favor of his bill that it supposedly puts safeguards to prevent voter fraud. Nobody wants to see voter fraud. That's a good reason, isn't it? But here's the truth. Federal law already prohibits citizens from voting in federal elections, non-citizens from voting in federal elections, and cases of non-citizens voting are extremely rare. In 2024, the Bipartisan Policy Center decided to figure out how frequently we encounter voter fraud in American elections. The Conservative Heritage Foundation election fraud database found in the period 1999 to 2023, 24 years, how many cases do you think they found of voter fraud? Incidents where non-citizens successfully cast ballots. Out of the millions and millions of votes that were cast, they found exactly 77 in a 24-year period. 77. Barely more than 3 per election cycle. And you say to yourself, where is the voter fraud that is leading the Republicans now to create new obstacles for voters to face if they want to register to vote? What's the real reason then, if there aren't only 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years? I'll tell you, it's for MAGA Republicans to cling to power by rigging the elections in November. It was the same motive when it came to creating new congressional districts for Republicans. This president is scared to death of what's going to happen when the American people finally get to say the last word on his policies. And so he wants to change the election rules. Hard to imagine. He's very blatant about it. They're not hiding it. The lead sponsor of the bill, the senior senator from Utah, said this weekend, and I quote, "Republicans will lose power likely for a long time if we don't get Save America passed. Unless we change the rules on registering and voting, even though there's little or no evidence of fraud and abuse, this Republican senator who's leading the charge concedes the obvious. It'll hurt them in the next election if they fail to pass this bill. They don't think they can win the election fair and square, so they need to change the rules and make it harder for eligible voters." So what's in this Republican political life raft that's on the floor? Among the provisions is one that requires all states to obtain proof of citizenship in person. 2 critical words, in person, from people looking to register to vote. In their bill, a driver's license, the most common form of identification in America, and most real IDs, would not be enough to register to vote. You need more. You've got to prove your citizenship before you can register under the Republican plan. Only birth certificates, passports, similar documentation would count. Well, let's go through those. How many Americans actually know where their original birth certificate can be found? And how about those who have a birth certificate with the maiden name of a woman who's married or in a hyphenated relationship? What are you going to do with those documents? And do you know how many Americans don't have a passport? Almost half of the people living in America have no passport. Half of the population. You say to yourself, well, go get a passport. There can't be much to it. Have you tried lately? You know what it costs? $165. So before you get to vote, you got to write a check for a passport for $165. That applies to 146 million Americans. And how long does it take? Well, I can tell you the people work hard to get out the millions of passports each year. But we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks, in some cases months. If you put an extra $60 on it, make it $225, they'll expedite it. That's your poll tax. You want to vote? You want to register? You got a passport? If you don't, get ready to fork over $165 to over $200 for a passport. And when you consider how long you have to wait, how long you have to wait for the opportunity to have this passport, maybe you're not doing it in time for this election. That's the Republican plan. Make it more bureaucratic and more cumbersome and more confusing, despite the fact there is little or no evidence of voter fraud in the United States. What this amounts to is a modern-day poll tax for a passport. This bill would also unfairly impact married women who've taken on their spouses' names. They either have to amend their original proof of citizenship documents or go through paperwork and a bureaucracy to register to vote. You're going to hear from my Republican colleagues about how this bill has been updated to accommodate people that don't have the required documentation. But the fact remains, Unnecessary barriers are being put in place to block access to the ballot for no apparent reason. 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years. Is that a national scale? Of course not. Here's the good news. At this moment, my Republican colleagues in the Senate don't have the votes to pass the bill. So now the question is, will the majority leader throw out the Senate rules and bend to the president's pressure? I certainly hope not. If we truly believe, as President Johnson said, that we must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that we participate in, then we must reject this terrible legislation which will deny the right to vote to eligible voters across the United States. The Save America Act is an affront to the fundamental right to vote, and I'll be voting no. I yield the floor.
President.
Senior Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
As Republican leader, I always enjoyed calling our colleagues' attention to longtime Senate staff as they notched milestones of service in our institution. Well, today, I'd like to reflect for a few moments on a longtime advisor who's an institution in his own right. There have been any number of occasions over the past several decades when it would have been right and fitting to praise the talents and service of Paul Grove. There's certainly been no shortage of situations where, except for the efforts of this one man, the Senate might have missed opportunities to advance America's influence on the world stage. The longtime Republican clerk at the Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations is quite literally that good. But Paul, like so many of the brightest unelected members of the Senate family, is also good at dodging credit for his extraordinary service to the Senate and to our country. Well, not this time. Tomorrow will mark a cumulative 30 years of Senate service for Paul, 25 of them consecutively. He's got more Senate experience than 96 of our elected colleagues. And as his first Senate boss, I'm invoking my right to say a few words about it. Long before Paul Grove was the Senate's resident expert on the levers of American soft power and our trusted emissary to the furthest corners of Southeast Asia and even beyond, he was a junior legislative aide to a freshman senator. And if memory serves, I initially paid him to advise me on, believe it or not, health care policy. In that sense, Paul's career resembles many Capitol Hill success stories. Show up with intelligence, a good work ethic, and let the rest of it sort itself out. But with due respect to the many thousands of smart and hardworking staff who walk these halls, Paul Grove's engine runs on an even rarer fuel, a deep, sincere, and abiding belief that the task before him was good and worthy of his best. My fellow appropriators understand that when folks complain about how the sausage is made, here in Washington, they're referring to us and the complex ways that we try to keep the lights on around here. But if you're ever tempted to think it's all a bunch of grizzled paper pushers and number crunchers untethered to the real world, I would encourage you to spend some time with Paul Grove. My good friend Robin Cleveland, who preceded Paul at the subcommittee, described him as a true believer. That's dead right. He's a true believer in the dividends of American leadership, the power of our influence, and the prospects of democracy, even in places where it seems to be on the ropes. Perhaps that's why the only thing ever pulled Paul away from the Senate and our important role in shaping American foreign policy was the chance to go even closer to the front lines. By the time Paul returned from several years in Cambodia, where he supported fledgling democracy movements across Southeast Asia, he was the obvious choice to help me lead the subcommittee. And while no one could fill Robin's shoes, Paul brought his own, and they fit perfectly. His approach, certainly less profane, but no less fortunate and formidable. Ask anyone from the State Department who's dealt with Paul whether it's worth trying to dodge his pointed inquiries. During my time as chairman, Paul and I crisscrossed the world together. And I learned the hard way that Paul's approach to trip planning could have made even our late friend, the intrepid John McCain, think twice. On my first CODEL to Iraq and Afghanistan with Paul, he had us wake up in Pakistan, attend briefings and lunch in Afghanistan, refuel in Oman, and have dinner in Turkey. Paul may have been the only one still awake during that dinner. And I tried to institute a maximum 2 countries per day rule after that. In capitals and far-flung outposts alike, Paul's devotion to our mission made me smarter and more effective. And I'm sure my successors at the subcommittee, Judd Gregg and now Chairman Lindsey Graham, know the feeling. No doubt, so did full committee leaders like Ted Stevens and Ted Cochran and Richard Shelby, and now Susan Collins. When I look back on this chapter of our work together, I'm particularly grateful for Paul's focus on a cause that's come to mean a great deal to both of us, the pro-democracy movement in Burma. As the old saying goes, success has 1,000 fathers. Needless to say, Washington hasn't exactly jumped to claim credit for the modest progress of Burma, brave champion of democracy. Like our dear friend Aung San Suu Kyi, who sits today in house arrest under the thumb of a military junta. And yet, for friends of the people of Burma, Paul Grove has been a constant presence. Scrutinize every development, pressing successive administrations towards sensible U.S. policy that counters PRC influence and holds the military junta to account. And tending the embers of hope for people who have faced far more than their fair share of hardship. Paul has been to the bottom of seemingly intractable challenges across the globe, but never lost sight of America's interest in resolving them. He became a master of using the power of the purse to compel transparency, extract justice for Americans, reward dedicated partners in oil, or sometimes replace squeaky gears in the machine of soft power. Frankly, to the extent that America has had more responsible friends and capable allies in the fight against terrorism, or communism, or authoritarianism, it's been in no small part due to Paul's dogged efforts. So, Mr. President, I've been fortunate to get have the opportunity to hire a lot of very smart and dedicated young patriots during my time here in the Senate. Very rarely have I managed to draw on their talents for as long as I've been able to learn and lean on Paul Grove. So today, with 30 years under his belt, it's a good time to say thank you, Paul.
Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, at a time when our country faces unprecedented crises, the United States Senate has spent an entire week debating a problem that essentially does not exist. The goal of the SAVE Act that is on the floor right now is to make certain that non-citizens do not vote in American elections. I don't know that anyone disagrees with that. And the good news is that non-citizens do not vote in American elections. Study after study has shown that the number of undocumented immigrants voting in American elections is virtually non-existent. We are debating a problem that does not exist. The Conservative Heritage Foundation found that over a recent 24-year period, 24 years, there have been a grand total of 77 confirmed instances of undocumented immigrants voting in the United States. 24 years, 77 undocumented immigrants voting. Hundreds of millions of people voted in a 24-year period, and there were 77 instances of non-citizens voting. That is according to the Conservative Heritage Foundation. What about individual states who have looked at this issue? What have they found? Well, the state of Utah found that of the state's 2.1 million registered voters in 2025 and 2026, a grand total, all right, here we go, a grand total of one non-citizen registered to vote in that state. And that individual never cast a ballot. 2.1 million registered voters in Utah, no non-citizens registered to vote. 2024, Idaho reviewed its 1 million registered voters and found 36 possible non-citizens registered to vote. 2024, Georgia, state of Georgia ordered its 8.2 million registered voters and found 20 non-citizens registered to vote. Overall, not only are there a tiny number of people undocumented who are registered to vote, most of those citizens have never even voted. They just registered to vote for whatever reason and were properly removed from the voter rolls. Let us be clear. Federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, and no state, not one of our 50 states, allows non-citizens to vote in state elections. But, Mr. President, if this legislation were to be passed, it would create a whole lot more problems than it would solve. Under this bill, every American would be required to have a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, as many as 69 million married women have last names that do not match their birth certificates and would need to provide additional documentation proving their name change in order to register to vote. Further, an estimated 4 million Americans have had their birth certificate or other necessary documents stolen or destroyed. If you're watching this out there, just think, do you have a birth certificate? How are you going to get a birth certificate? How many weeks, months? How much does it cost? You're going to have to go through all the bureaucracy to get your birth certificate. Even worse, want a passport to vote? Well, half of Americans, 146 million people, don't have a valid passport. Those who would need a passport to vote under this bill would have to spend $130 to renew a passport or $165 for a new one. And by the way, you're going to have to wait up to 6 weeks to get it. So, make no mistake about it, this legislation is nothing more than a modern-day poll tax that would deprive millions of low-income, working-class Americans from being able to vote. So what is this bill really about? Well, good news is President Trump has told us what it's about. Trump has said that if this legislation were signed into law, Republicans would, quote, never lose a race. For 50 years, we won't lose a race, end of quote. Well, my understanding of election reform would be to make sure that the United States made it possible for more people to participate in the political process, make sure that we had one of the highest levels of voter participation rather than one of the lower rates of voter turnout in the world. In other words, we want to strengthen our democracy, not throw millions of people off the voting rolls, so, to quote President Trump, Republicans would never lose a race. Mr. President, instead of spending a week on a non-existent problem, maybe it's time we started to focus on some of the enormous crises facing our country. And let me just take a moment to mention a few. Never before in American history have so few individuals had so much wealth and so much power. During the Gilded Age in this country with Rockefeller and Carnegie, you had a handful of people who had enormous wealth and enormous power. Nothing compared to what exists today. Today we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had in the history of this country. Think that might be an issue that we should be talking about? Do you think we might be suggesting that there is something wrong when the top 1% in America now own more wealth than the bottom 93%? Do you think we might be talking about making some changes in an economic system in where 60% of our people today are living paycheck to paycheck, families struggling to feed their kids, pay for health care, pay for rent, pay for child care, pay for the basic necessities of life? 60% of our people live in paycheck to paycheck, and one guy, Elon Musk, owns more wealth than the bottom 53% of American households. Think maybe that might be an issue that we should be talking about? But, Mr. President, one of the reasons we don't talk about that issue and many other vital issues that impact working families is the reality that Congress today is much more concerned about protecting the needs of its campaign contributors, the billionaires who are putting an unprecedented amount of money into the political process, rather than representing the needs of working families throughout America. No great secret As a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, the billionaires in this country, Democrats, but more Republicans, putting huge amounts of money into the political process. And the Congress is quickly becoming a corporately owned entity. Maybe we might want to talk about how we get rid of big money in politics and create a democracy in which every person has one vote, not where billionaires can spend unlimited amounts of money to elect candidates who represent their interests. And I should tell you, Mr. President, that one way I believe that we begin to tackle the massive level of income and wealth inequality that exists is by imposing a wealth tax on the 938 billionaires in America who are worth some $8.2 trillion. Legislation that I have proposed, the wealth tax on billionaires, would not impact anybody in America who is not a billionaire. But over a 10-year period, this legislation would raise $4.4 trillion, strictly from the people on top, the 1/10 of 1%, minuscule number of people who are doing unbelievably well. And what would we use that $4.4 trillion for? Well, let me just briefly tell you. For a start, in the first year, at a time when working-class families are struggling to put food on the table and pay their rent, this legislation would provide every man, woman, and child in the country in a household making $150,000 or less a $3,000 direct payment, $12,000 for a family of four. So at a time when the billionaires have never had it so good, when many of them are paying virtually nothing in taxes, we're going to demand that they start paying their fair share so that working-class, low-income families can get some help, $3,000 for every man, woman, and child in families of less than $150,000. This legislation would end homelessness in America and address the affordable housing crisis by building 7 million units of low-income and affordable homes and apartments. 20 million households in America should not be forced to spend half of their limited incomes on housing. We should not have 800,000 people sleeping out on the streets. Instead of giving tax breaks to billionaires, we should be building low-income and affordable housing. This bill would expand Medicare. In Vermont and all over this country, you got elderly people, can't afford dental care, can't afford hearing aids, can't afford vision care. This legislation would expand Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing. Last poll that I saw on that, only 90% of the American people supported it. Maybe we may want to pass it. This legislation would provide universal child care in America and make sure that no one in our country pays more than 7% of their limited incomes on child care. At a time when school districts in Vermont and around the country are having a hard time attracting good teachers because the pay scale is much too low, we would make sure that no teacher in America earns less than $60,000 a year. This legislation would also make sure that seniors and people with disabilities receive the home health care they need through Medicaid. And by the way, this legislation would prevent 15 million Americans from losing health care by repealing Trump's $1.1 trillion cut to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. And we do all of that just by asking the very wealthiest people in this country, the fewer than 1,000 billionaires, to pay 5% of their wealth in taxes. And you know, after that, I know people, editorial writers all over America, very worried about what happens to poor Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos and Mr. Zuckerberg. The good news is they will still have enough money with their hundreds of billions of dollars left to feed their families. I don't want anybody to think that the Musk family or the Bezos family will go hungry. We leave them with hundreds of billions of dollars. And the other thing, Mr. President, that we got to do, instead of dealing with non-existent problems like the SAVE Act, we got to address the threat of artificial intelligence and robotics. And surprise, surprise, our very same friends, Mr. Musk, Mr. Bezos, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Ellison, Mr. Thiel, and others are pouring huge amounts of money into AI and robotics. Left unchecked, these technologies will bring about a massive transformation of American economic, political, and social life. That's what we're talking about. And that transformation of American life, economic, political, social, is being pushed by a handful of multi-billionaires. And it is time for the United States Congress to say, slow it down. And it's not only what it will do to throwing millions of workers off of their jobs, hooking children to artificial intelligence. I've talked to a number of scientists who believe that we're not talking about science fiction anymore, in the sense that if AI continues to develop and become smarter than humans, the truth is AI may become independent of human control and threaten the very existence of humanity. Now, I know that the future of humanity and the existence of whether or not we survive, not quite as important as dealing with legislation dealing with a non-existent problem like undocumented people voting. But maybe, just maybe, we might want to spend a few minutes determining whether or not we should slow down AI so that humanity survives, so that tens of millions of people do not lose their jobs, so that kids do not lose their mental health by becoming addicted to AI, etc. So bottom line, Mr. President, there are enormous issues facing this country. It is no great secret that the American people increasingly understand that the work of this Congress right now is to protect the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. And maybe it's time we started worrying about working families and ordinary Americans. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
So I actually would like to continue exactly the theme that my colleague from Vermont brought up. Except I think before we talk about artificial intelligence, we should talk about natural intelligence. And it absolutely goes against natural intelligence for us to sit here in this chamber knowing that we have 260,000 working American families who work for our government, who are doing their job and not getting paid. That, to me, is the crisis we should be talking about. And yes, I agree with my colleague from Vermont. We should not be worried about Mr. Musk or any of the other billionaires going hungry. I worry about our TSA agents going hungry. I worry about our Coast Guard people going hungry. I worry about the people at FEMA going hungry. And yet, with total disregard for over 250,000 families, we sit in this chamber and we're getting paid. Everybody here is getting paid, and yet they're not. And I applaud my colleague from Vermont who's walking out of the floor, caring about working Americans. Why don't we care about them? Why don't we fund DHS now? Why don't we worry about those families who, by the way, according to the last Secretary of Homeland Security, the last one said, and I'm going to quote here, the average TSA agent lives paycheck to paycheck. We've taken away 3 paychecks. 3 paychecks we've taken away from them. If there's ever a time that we need to fund DHS, it's now. This is not a Republican secretary saying that. It's a Democrat Secretary of Homeland Security saying that. I don't understand how in a leadership role, which is what we are here in the United States Senate, we would allow the suffering of 260,000 families to go with this much contempt and instead fund DHS in its entirety. Allow those families to get paid. Mr. President, you were a business guy like I was. Could you ever look at yourself in the mirror when you owned your businesses and know because of your actions the people who worked for you weren't getting paid and were suffering? It's impossible. I remember when I started my first business, I felt the weight of success because I had to take care of my family. But those early families for that first business that I bought, every day I walked in, I felt this incredible responsibility. Like, man, if I made bad decisions, Like if I make a bad decision today, people will go hungry who work for me. And that drove me to succeed. We are totally disconnected here. We sit here in this chamber, it doesn't even touch any of us. And I think that's a disgrace. I think we should very simply do what's always been done before we became this hyper-partisan chamber. We fund the government responsibly. And then, if we have policy disagreements, we can sit down. By the way, right now, just down this hallway, there is Democrat colleagues and Republican colleagues of good faith sitting down to negotiate differences to get the Department of Homeland Security funded. We have American citizens that are paying taxes to fund a government to work that is not working. I know that sometimes pleading with my colleagues to have some level of humanity is ineffective, because quite frankly, maybe this place takes a little humanity away from you. Maybe you don't see how these decisions affect many, many people. So with that, Mr. President, I'm going to ask a very, very, very simple request. Very simple. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that this body, the United States Senate, proceed to immediate consideration of calendar number 156, H.R. 4553. I further ask that the substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered and read a third time and passed, and that the motions to be considered be made and laid upon the table. And what this means in English to the person who may be watching is this funds the entire Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Everybody gets paid up to date. We get the department open, and then let the work that's being done now proceed. I ask that that happen.
Is there an objection? Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. President, I object. And I think, look, all of us here understand, because we travel twice a week, what TSA is going through. That's why we should immediately today fully fund TSA. If you care about paying TSA, let's pay TSA today. Oh, I'm sorry. I object. If we want to actually pay TSA, let's do it right now. My colleague from Ohio, we both know what it's like to go back and forth to the Midwest every single week. Want to fund TSA? Want to have humanity for the people who are securing us? Let's fully fund them today.
So I'm not sure.
Senator from Ohio.
Sorry, Mr. President, sorry about that. I'm not sure what I just heard, because I just offered to fund TSA. I just offered to fund the Coast Guard, FEMA, Customs and Border Patrol, Secret Service, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, USCIS, Homeland Security Investigations. So let's do it for 2 weeks. Let's do that for 2 weeks. Down the hall, there are senators of good faith that are getting together to end this political charade. So to my colleague, I will yield the floor for a simple question. Why would you want to fund just TSA and not the Coast Guard? Not, for example, in your state, the American Immigration Council is that deals with 102,700 undocumented immigrants in Michigan. Why wouldn't you want enforcement around that? Why wouldn't you want to fund the department that allows people like me, who when I was 18 years old applied for citizenship, why wouldn't we want to fund 3,300 employees, some of them in your state, that actually process legal immigrants? Like, why wouldn't we fund that? Why wouldn't we fund 7,000 special agents that are there to stop transnational criminals? Why wouldn't we fund 200 employees that fund, and you were a CIA agent, that fund biological nuclear threat prevention? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we fund 60,000 employees at Customs? You care a lot about the bridge that was hopefully due to be opened from Canada. You need Border Patrol agents there. You need Customs there. Why wouldn't we fund that? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that for 2 weeks? 2 weeks. And then we can get together. Why wouldn't we do that? Why just fund one narrow slice of the Department of Homeland Security? I'm just curious why you would do that.
Will the senator yield? So here's the thing. I think
Michigan is recognized.
I'm sorry, pardon me. I think it is not hard to notice that right now our country is going through a pretty fundamental conversation about the role of ICE and law enforcement in our city streets. We know that it's a cultural conversation in the United States of America because the previous Secretary of Homeland Security got fired because of the disaster that went on in Minneapolis. I sat, as you did, in the hearing with Mark Wayne Mullen yesterday because we need a new Secretary of Homeland Security. Every American in the world, Democrat and Republican, understands that's because ICE so deeply contradicted American values in our American cities. So we're having a full-on cultural conversation about the role of law enforcement in our streets. In the meantime, you and I can agree every day of the week on the role of Border Patrol, CBP, FEMA, which we desperately need, Coast Guard, which no one has more Coast Guard pretty much than Michigan. So I'm ready to fund those things now. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that ICE is right now an unsettled issue in the United States of America. We're not settled. People are negotiating because we're not settled. And even this week, the President of the United States sent a letter down here to talk about the reforms he acknowledges we need in some form or fashion. Now, some of those reforms to me are like basic and don't go far enough, like we won't deport American citizens. But even the President acknowledges we have a problem with ICE. So let's excise that one part that we are having an American conversation on, and then fully stuff here and now today. That's what I'm proposing.
Will you yield for a question?
Of course.
Thank you. Look, I appreciate, and I know you're a person of good character, by the way. I genuinely believe that. But that's not what you're asking for. You're asking to fund just TSA. But meaning, the question is this. Why would we use 260,000 people and their families as pawns in a negotiation? Why wouldn't we pay all those people? So will you consider adding a bill that I've put together that says that as long as we haven't fully funded the government, we get money taken out of our paychecks, not held in suspension, that we actually would lose compensation, about $500 a day, every day that goes by where we haven't fully funded the government? Would you consider adding that to your resolution?
Will you yield?
You have the floor.
Sorry, I don't know the rules here, but sorry, Mr. Speaker, if you have to.
The Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. So first of all,
the President is enjoying this debate.
I am proposing today just the UC on TSA, but my colleagues, one after another, have proposed funding the Coast Guard, Border Patrol, FEMA. So whichever way we want to do the package, individually or all but ICE, I'm here for it. And I'll do you one better on your proposal. I 100% agree. When I first came into Congress in 2019, we were in a government shutdown in the first Trump administration, right? President Trump had a shutdown. That's how I came into Congress. And my very first bill as a congressperson, bipartisan, by the way, the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bunch of us did it, was that if the government isn't fully funded, then Congresspeople, A, do not get paid, and B, I'll go one further, are not allowed to have government pay for their travel back home, meaning they have to sit their butts down in Washington and negotiate and get it done then and there without taking taxpayer dollars to go back home. So whether you want to add a $500 fee, whatever it is, this body is for appropriating money. So I'm here for whatever you want to propose. But I think you have to acknowledge, even the President acknowledges at this point, that the American public, Democrat, Independent, and Republican, does not like American citizens being killed in our streets. They do not like going into a human being's home without a judicial warrant. They don't like children being taken and tear gassed and caught in the crossfire. Non-well-trained officers pulling people out of cars and getting into dangerous situations, people being targeted. You should hate this. When you're walking into Target, they had ICE officers pulling people aside because they looked like they were immigrants and checking their papers. You know what that does to a Jew? You know what that means to just check people's papers because of how they look? You should hate that. So for me, whether we agree or disagree, and I would hope we'd agree on the use of force in America, set that aside, fund everything else today, now, here, penalize members of the Senate who want to go home and ignore the problem. I'm with you on that, but you are holding all of those agencies hostage because of ICE. You are defending them and not allowing them to get their paycheck. You are holding them back from those 3 paychecks, not Democrats. We are here ready to pay. You are so protective of ICE, so protective of this president, that you will not fund the other parts of DHS, and that is our Homeland Security. I know about that. That is my entire life. You know, you care about that. I know you do, Senator. So please, just excise the thing we're not agreeing on, fund the rest of it, let's get on with it, and understand that the American public have made their voice clear on this issue.
We yield for
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
So, Homeland Investigations is part of ICE. It's 7,000 special agents that work for ICE that stop transnational criminals. You're not suggesting that we not fund them, are you?
I am suggesting that we get everybody in a room. Sorry, if I can yield. That we get everyone in a room on Homelands on the ICE issue. Lock them in a room here in the Capitol. Our negotiators. I need the president to send his envoy so we can actually make some decisions. It has been hard to negotiate with Senate Republicans on this issue because they need the blessing of the White House. Get all the players in a room. We will sit down. I'll do it. I'll be here all day and all night, all weekend. But I got to tell you, you can't use one group of people as a shield to not fund all the other border missions, all the other funding of the FEMA. You can't do it.
So one more question, with your permission. So nobody on your side has agreed to fund USCIS. You have not suggested that. USCIS is an independent part of the Department of Homeland Security. That has not been suggested by any Democrat. I appreciate that you are. Nobody has agreed to fund the Bioweapons of Mass Destruction Agency, not been suggested. And you've specifically, meaning not you personally, the Democrat senators have specifically said they do not want to fund customs, which you understand really well what customs means, and border protection. Like that, these agencies that are listed on this board, there has been no movement among Democrats to fund this, and this is why my point is the same. I'm not suggesting to my colleague from Michigan at all that we permanently fund this forever. What I'm saying is 2 weeks. Let's reopen the Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Let's let people of good faith, you and I, look, we agree on what you said. Let's take our paychecks away. Let's prevent us from flying home. Let's make us, I'll use your words, keep our butts here until we get this done. If that means today, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, we can play pickleball in between. It'll be fantastic, okay? But we don't leave. If that means right through Easter, by the way, we do not leave this chamber, and we do not get, and we lose pay every day that goes by until we've funded the whole thing, because we can work it out. We can work this out. But I look at some of your colleagues who said they're serene as to where we are on this. I don't think there's 260,000 families that are serene about this, and I don't think you are either. So again, I would just ask that you amend your resolution to say let's fund the entire department for 2 weeks. We don't want to defund ICE. I'm not hearing you say that. I hear some of your other colleagues say that, but we're not looking to defund ICE, and we're certainly not going to stop Homeland Investigations. Let's fund the whole thing for 2 weeks. Let's get the American people to understand we can get things done. Let's not absolutely leave, forget D.C., let's not leave this chamber, the Capitol, until we get this done. That's my ask, that's my plea.
Sir from Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 362 S4127, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio is recognized.
Reserving my right to object, just to be clear what was just proposed. What was just proposed is to fund just TSA. Nothing else. Nothing else. And what's wrong with that, in case you didn't hear the peanut gallery, what's wrong with that is that there's hundreds of thousands of other government employees who, for no fault of their own, they did nothing wrong. They didn't do anything to do with what happened in Minneapolis. No role in that whatsoever. They go to work every day, doing the best they can to keep us safe. Mr. President, yesterday, for the first time in my life, I attended a dignified transfer ceremony in Dover. I'm thinking to myself, these 3 Ohioans, what did they die for? They died to preserve freedom for us. They didn't ask any questions. They went willingly. They volunteered. Can we honor their sacrifice by saying, do the right thing? Fund the Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks. Senators, stay here without pay, not held pay, docked pay, because we haven't done our job. Article 1, we are the power of the purse. So I would ask one last time before concluding this. Can I get my colleague from Michigan, who's a good person, to agree to amend her proposal to fund the entire Department of Homeland Security for 2 weeks and then force every senator, and I think that she has the influence to convince her colleagues to stay here without pay until this gets done.
Is there objection to the request?
Yeah.
I repeat, is there an objection to the request?
Yes.
I object. I don't.
The objection is heard. Is there an objection to the original request?
I, with a broken heart, object. And we did not do the right thing for the American people today, Mr. President. It's a shame. Politics got in the way of helping working Americans. It's a disgrace.
The objection is heard. Senator from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. I want to talk a little bit about the SAVE Act. Now, despite its name, SAVE Act's not going to help you or anyone in America save on anything. It won't help you save on your gas bill, your medicine, your rent. It won't help you save on student loans or child care, what you pay for your utilities. This bill has nothing to do with money at all, and it certainly isn't about helping Americans. We're going to fight against this bill with everything we've got, and it will fail because it's bad for the country. And that's right. The Republicans know the bill will fail, and they are intent on dragging this out for hours, for days, that could be spent addressing the real issues that Americans face. The cost of gas is rising every day, week after week. In parts of Colorado, the price of gasoline has almost doubled in the last several weeks. That's money taken straight out of your pockets. Grocery prices are going up. Doctors' visits are going up. Housing costs are going up as well. Right now, 1 in 3 American households spend more than 30% of their income on housing, 1/3. And when they're not shelling out for rent, They're shelling out more for health care. Despite living in the wealthiest country in the world, Americans pay the highest costs for health care globally, and in many cases get worse results. But we don't have to tell all of America this. We don't have to tell all of you this. You already know it. You're living it every single day. At the checkout line, in the pharmacy, the doctor's office, when you pay your electric or water bill. And here's what makes it work. You're doing everything right. You're working longer hours, picking up second jobs. You're cutting back in every way you can to make ends meet. You're skipping vacations. You're delaying buying a home. You're putting off starting a family. Some folks today are even skipping doses of medication just to stretch their prescription a few more days. This is not because you want to, but because you have no choice. You see no other way. A year ago, at his inauguration, our president promised lower prices and no more foreign wars. This administration has already spent $20 billion of your dollars waging war on Iran. And the war has gotten bigger, bloodier, and more expensive every day since. Just today, the Pentagon announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. $200 billion. That's money that we don't have. Our deficit last year was somewhere in the vicinity of $1.75 trillion. And yet, Congress is going to be asked to borrow $200 billion more, add that to the national debt. The SAVE Act isn't going to save any of that. It's not going to save any American any money. And it certainly isn't going to change reality. So what is it really about? I think it's about saving this administration's failing agenda. And how is that? It's through voter suppression. The president knows that costs are high. He knows that you're angry. He knows that the majority of Americans disapprove of the war or are unhappy that their costs keep rising. But instead of actually lowering prices, he's backing a bill that's going to make it harder for most people to vote, especially for Americans who he doesn't trust will vote for him. The Save America Act creates mountains of red tape for voters and will ultimately remove millions of Americans from the voting rolls, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It requires every voter to dig through their basement, go up into their attic, and try to find their birth certificate, right? Find their passport, just so they can register to vote, something most of them have been doing year after year for decades. But there are problems, real problems, with this plan. More than 21 million Americans, 21 million American citizens, don't have their original birth certificate handy, or they don't have a passport. They don't have either one of these types of identification. And 69 million married women have birth certificates that don't have their correct last name. They changed their name when they got married. Taken together, the Save America Act would make it more difficult for tens of millions of people to vote. It would also dismantle vote by mail as we know it. Now, about 1 in 3 Americans voted by mail in 2024, an election that President Trump won. During the 2024 election, the voters most likely to vote by mail were those over the age of 65. It's the single best way for folks with limited mobility to exercise their constitutional right. Just look at Colorado. Almost 99% of Republican voters in Colorado voted by mail in 2025. Now, way back in 2013, when I was still the governor, we passed a set of laws that established our state as the gold standard for secure and accessible elections. We started by making voting as accessible as possible. We established one of the first universal vote-by-mail systems in the country. Now, you can still vote in person, but every single Coloradan gets a ballot mailed to them. Now, these reforms were largely created by Republican county clerks working with our Republican Secretary of State. Vote by mail has proven to be less expensive, more secure, and people love it. The turnout just goes up. It's perhaps the single most effective way to increase voter turnout. Today, as I said, every single registered voter gets a ballot in the mail. Every ballot that they receive in the mail is printed on paper, meaning that we have a physical record across the entire voting system that can be easily audited, even the faintest hint of fraud. And we go beyond that. I mean, it is basic common sense. The ballot arrives weeks before the election, gives Coloradans plenty of time to research the candidates, talk around the kitchen table who they think is going to do the best job, and submit their ballot by mail or go drop it off at a ballot box. And even if voters wait until the last minute, they can still register to vote and vote on Election Day. Now, Colorado Republicans were behind this initiative literally every step of the way, because this was about making voting, the act of voting, making that easier for everyone. Coloradans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, we have almost a third, actually we have more than a third independents now. Everybody loves this system. During the 2025 election, 98% of all the Coloradans who voted by mail. They submitted mail-in ballots. They dropped it off or they put it in the mail. And Coloradans didn't just make voting accessible, we made it secure. We created a multi-layered system of checks and balances. Every single ballot, every single drop box that receives ballots is under 24-hour video surveillance from the time the box opens for ballot return until the end of an election, day and night. We made sure Coloradans could track their ballot the same way you would use FedEx or UPS to track a package, so voters could trust that their ballot had been counted. And in 2017, under the leadership of Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, Colorado took election security to the next level. We became the first state in the nation to conduct a bipartisan statewide audit after every election. The results from these audits over the last 6 years show that Colorado's vote counting systems were more than 99.99% accurate. We put the burden on a team of Democratic and Republican leaders to use the state's resources, in other words, the state pays for this, to ensure that every person who votes is eligible, and every vote counted matches the ballot. Now, the SAVE Act would completely reverse this progress. It would bog down the voter in endless mountains of new red tape. And in the end, millions of Americans wouldn't cast a ballot at all. Now think about and ask yourself who this really impacts. Seniors who no longer drive, rural Americans who live hours from a government office. These are likely Republican voters, but it's going to impact them negatively. It will impact working parents who can't take time off to track down paperwork or take work off to vote in person. It would impact women whose last names have changed, as I mentioned. At the end of the day, none of it helps you, the voter. It's all a distraction, a rather large distraction. I mean, every hour that we're spending in the debate about the Save America Act is an hour we're not spending bringing down the cost of groceries or housing, health care. While Americans are worrying and continue to worry and they are worried, while Americans are worried about costs, they're worried about their families and their future, the administration is relitigating the 2020 election and waging a war most Americans don't want. All of this chaos, from Colorado to Venezuela to Iran to Minnesota, it's one big distraction from this administration's failure to lower costs for Americans. The bill was never about saving Americans money. They call it the SAVE Act, creates a misrepresentation. But what we should be here today to accomplish is to figure out how to save money for the Americans, American people, for all of you. If your agenda is working and you're delivering on promises, you don't have to make it harder for people to vote. I would argue that agenda might not be working. I think the results, if your agenda is working, and the people speak for themselves. So let me spell it out. Americans want lower costs. Not wars abroad, not violence in the streets. Americans are looking literally for any sign that this administration still sees them, still sees the rising grocery costs, the gas prices, the huge bill increases from doctors' offices. Excuse me. This administration refuses to acknowledge these problems exist. And there's so much infighting within the president's ranks that they can't decide whether this war will go on for 2 weeks or 5 weeks or a year. Are American troops going to be deployed? The jury's still out on that as well. It's a lot of noise and not a lot of substance. So far, there's no evidence for a comprehensive plan. And certainly no, and by that I mean zero, accountability to the American people. Let's remember, the Pentagon just announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. They want the American taxpayers to sign off on borrowing, because we don't have the cash, to borrow $200 billion more money. $200 billion more. With that kind of money, we could fund universal pre-K in every state in this country. We could get to universal health care coverage. We could have free school meals for every child. We could free community college for every American for a full year. So when they shout out the importance of the SAVE Act, remember this one thing. It will not help you save a penny on your rent, your groceries, the cost of your health care. The only thing it's saving, I would argue, is their political skin. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I'd like to note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks.
I recognize the senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
Yes.
Mr. President, is everything okay?
Perfect. Nothing to see here.
Well, Mr. President, I'm back here to speak again on the Save America
Request.
I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I'm back again, Mr. President, to address the Save America Act. And what I can't really get my brain around is the fact that in a recent poll, 71% of Americans support the Save American Act. Now, it's no secret that our nation is politically polarized, but when 71% of Americans think that this is a good idea and we can't get it done, is pretty hard to explain. So let me try. So why would you say that we oppose only American citizens being able to vote? Why would you say that? Why would you oppose the proposition that only American citizens can vote? And why would you oppose the proposition that in order to cast a ballot, that you need to produce an ID, a picture ID? Well, maybe there are other explanations that I haven't thought of, but the explanation that occurs to me is because you think that illegal aliens should be able to vote. Maybe you think that people should not have to produce a photo ID so they can pretend to be somebody they are not and cast a ballot on their behalf. I wish our Democratic colleagues would just come out and fess up and admit that that's their motivation. Letting illegal aliens vote and letting people commit voter fraud by pretending to be somebody they're not because they're not required to produce a photo ID. Well, I can think of maybe one other explanation. So you remember back, Mr. President, when the President spoke at the State of the Union, he asked for all the members of the audience there assembled before him in front of the whole country to stand if you support law enforcement and public safety and not illegal immigrants. All Republicans stood, all Democrats sat on their hands. And I found it particularly telling when some of the TV camera zoomed in on some of the Democrats who were very, if I'm interpreting their body language correctly, they were very uncomfortable because they knew that what they were doing was wrong, but they felt like for some reason they had to do it. And then there's the decision of the President to eliminate the nuclear weapons program of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism. They've had American blood on their hands for 47 years since the Iranian Revolution, produced these explosively formed penetrators that killed or maimed service members of the United States over many years. Their proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Shia militias, they have American blood on their hands. And the Biden administration and previous administrations knew that they aspired to have a nuclear weapon. Now, I cannot imagine anything worse than the #1 state sponsor of terrorism getting a nuclear weapon. They're committed to the death of Israel. They want to wipe Israel off the map, but they've also chanted death to America. What is it about that we don't understand and believe? And thank goodness, President Trump had the courage, political and otherwise, and the confidence in the United States military to do what needed to be done in order to protect our own troops in the Middle East and help prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. What do our Democratic colleagues do? They said, well, Trump started a war and there's no identifiable end state, so we oppose what President Trump is doing. So Trump derangement syndrome causes people to do really strange things, to take the side of the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism that wants a nuclear weapon, to cause members of Congress to sit on their hands rather than to support and applaud our law enforcement personnel that keep our communities safe. And now we see this happening at our airports across the country, where because of Democratic obstruction, our TSA agents, the people who are maintaining security at the airports, they've now missed 2 paychecks. And for what good reason could that be? Well, I think it's Trump derangement syndrome. They know that President Trump wants the Department of Homeland Security funded, which means they automatically, reflexively don't want it funded. And they frankly don't care who they hurt. It's shameful. It ought to be embarrassing. But some people can't be embarrassed. So Democrats are now forced into a strange posture on this Save America Act, which requires proof of citizenship to vote and proof of identification in order to cast your ballot. Democrats are forced into the awkward position of saying they should block this legislation that so many of their own constituents apparently want and agree with. I have to say, listening to some of the what passes for arguments on the other side, I find myself unpersuaded by their fear-mongering. I remember I asked in the Judiciary Committee the other day, I asked the ranking member, the Democratic whip, Senator Durbin from Illinois, I said, what is it that what Democrats dislike about the Save America Act? He said, well, it will disenfranchise people. Well, not if you can show you're an American citizen, not if you have photo ID. You're not going to be disenfranchised. So that must mean that you're worried about disenfranchising non-citizens, illegal immigrants. You're worried about disenfranchising the election cheat who wouldn't be required to show photo ID, but yet casts a ballot pretending to be someone they're not. Two days ago, Minority Leader Schumer came to the Senate floor and said the SAVE Act is not about election integrity. It is voter suppression. Well, he's half right. It's illegal voter suppression. But his general argument that American citizens would be denied the opportunity to vote is patently false. 38 states, including states like Georgia and Rhode Island, currently represented by Democrats, require voter ID. Are those states suppressing the vote? Is the minority leader suggesting that 38 out of our 50 states are actively engaged in voter suppression? Well, that's preposterous on its face. Some states, like my state, Texas, requires voters to show an ID with an option to sign an affidavit alongside of a secondary form of ID to establish their identity. In other words, we make it easy. So the idea that the Save America Act will disenfranchise legitimate voters is a bald-faced, well, let me try to be generous. It's not true. And he knows it. The Democratic leader knows that's false, but he has the temerity to stand up here on the Senate floor and to tell people who may not be informed about the details of this that we are trying to take away their right to vote. Well, it's the Democrats who are diluting your vote, if you're a qualified voter, by allowing non-citizens or people who engage in election fraud the opportunity to vote. They're diluting your vote, making it less valuable. So the Save America Act will not disenfranchise legitimate voters. It will simply universalize ID requirements so that all 50 states will play by the same rules. Another charge that we're hearing is that, well, it's just too hard to prove you're an American citizen because you need a passport. You'll need a passport to vote, and any requirement that you need a passport will be too burdensome. Well, of course, anybody who's traveled will have a passport, of course. But once again, this argument that you need a passport to vote is not true. The Save America Act allows Americans to prove their citizenship by a variety of documents, including but not limited to a passport. Americans can present an enhanced driver's license, a real ID compliant driver's license, or a state ID card, all of which are sufficient under this bill to prove you're an American citizen. I have a real ID driver's license in my pocket, as do most driver's licenses. We've required post 9/11 to prevent terrorists from getting false identities and traveling on our airplanes and blowing them out of the sky. We required that states eventually require a real ID, which just has a radio frequency chip in it that's hard to counterfeit, so that we have assurance that people who produce a driver's license with a real ID in it are who they say they are. So you don't need a passport. You can use a military identification card. You can use a certificate of naturalization. If you weren't born in this country but became, by grace of God, an American citizen. Furthermore, if an American does not have any of the above, they can pair a photo ID with their birth certificate, a consular report of birth abroad, or similar documents. In other words, there's a lot of different ways that people can establish that they are qualified to vote. Finally, and perhaps the most outrageous charge that our Democratic colleagues have been flinging at us, is that married women, we're going to disenfranchise married women whose birth certificate does not reflect their current married name. They won't be able to vote. Well, that would be foolish if that were true. As somebody who is not only married for 46 years, but the father of 2 adult daughters, I promise I would be the last person on the planet to tell a woman she has no right to vote. So this is nothing but a scare tactic. Certainly, it's easy to be able to establish, based on a marriage license or something else, that some other qualifying document, that your birth certificate name is different than your married name. So this is nothing more than a scare tactic by our colleagues who want what? Why are they objecting to this? Well, let me put it less charitably. They want to make it easier for people to cheat. That's a harsh statement, but you tell me what the other alternatives are. They want to make it easier to cheat. The reality is that the Save America Act provides a process for anyone who changes their legal name for reasons of marriage or otherwise to register to vote. And anyone who's already registered to vote at the time they change their name would just have to update their voter registration. Well, I think women, voters, should be offended that somehow they're not capable of being able to identify themselves either with a marriage license or a birth certificate, or that it's just too hard for them. They can't figure it out. That's insulting. Well, I have full confidence that American citizens who happen to be female, who go through these heroic efforts to keep our businesses running and take care of our families, I have full confidence they'll be capable of updating their voter registration to match their new married name. To listen to our Democratic colleagues, you would think the American people are incapable of thinking for themselves or are incapable of simply locating these legal documents. And we're not doing this for frivolous reasons. It's because apparently our Democratic colleagues think that non-citizens should be allowed to vote, and that election fraudsters should be able to vote without proving their identity. On the behalf of the 32 million Texans I represent, I find this argument deeply offensive. America is the greatest place on earth. What we have here is the envy of people around the world who want to come here because of the opportunities that this great country provides. But one of the most important aspects of America is that our laws are passed by elected representatives and that our laws are legitimized by the consent of the governed, who cast a vote on behalf of those office holders, the members of Congress, on their behalf. And these are positions of trust that we hold. But the authority comes from the voters and comes from the citizens, not illegal immigrants, not election fraudsters. That undermines the very foundation upon which the legitimacy of our government rests. I think a country with citizens bright enough to put a man on the moon and to build the strongest, most powerful military in the world and the greatest economy the world has ever known, I think those folks are smart enough and capable enough to be able to locate their driver's license when they cast a ballot and to establish their citizenship in order to qualify to vote. Any suggestion to the contrary is ridiculous. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Five requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the minority and majority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Tennessee.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. President, I dropped the microphone there. I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
And thank you, Mr. President. You know, it is so interesting that we're finding ourselves here on a Thursday, and one of the pressing issues is DHS funding for Homeland Security. And I find it so interesting that my colleagues across the aisle continue to be given to this concept that they have grown over the last few years. And it is that we need to defund federal law enforcement, and we need to abolish ICE. And of course, we know they have made this commitment to their leftist base that what they're going to do is find a way to go through defunding federal law enforcement and abolishing ICE. And to them, that is the Holy Grail. So let's look at what this actually would do. I think it's important to note that the Department of Homeland Security, that ICE is already funded, fully funded, and will be fully funded through 2029. Now, they can rant and rave all day long, but nothing is going to change that. That is already there. We did that this summer, and it was in the big, beautiful bill, working family tax cut, but of course, they all voted no. No one on the Democrat side voted for that, even though it was the largest tax cut in our nation's history. So they obviously never read the bill to find out what was in the bill. But one would think that with this much time having passed, that they would be aware that ICE is fully funded. Now, what they are doing is prohibiting funding from FEMA, Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and other components of Homeland Security. And FEMA makes up 35% of the DHS budget. And Mr. President, I just think it is so important to note TSA is not being paid. And this is now day 35 that the Democrats have said to TSA and to the American people, we are going to use you as our pawns because we want to make certain that we are defunding federal law enforcement and we're abolishing ICE. So our TSA workers are out there working without a paycheck because of this singular focus of our friends across the aisle. I encourage them to set this aside. We need to make certain that Homeland Security investigations, that TSA, that FEMA, that the Coast Guard, that the Secret Service are all receiving appropriate funding, and that we make certain DHS, Homeland Security, has the funds to keep this nation safe. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I rise today to honor the life, service, and long-awaited homecoming of Private Luther LaRue Dusty Rhodes of Edneyville, Henderson County, North Carolina, a United States Marine who gave his life in defense of our nation during World War II. Luther Rhodes was born in Eddyville on March 22, 1924, and raised on his family's farm in the Blue Ridge, Appalachian Mountains, by his parents, Harley and Lexine Rhodes, alongside 9 brothers and sisters. From an early age, Luther learned the values of hard work, devotion to family, and responsibility to others, values that shaped the man that he would become and guided his decision to serve his country. At just 17 years old, Luther was determined to enlist. After receiving his father's permission, he joined the United States Marine Corps on November 11th, 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He completed recruit training at Parris Island and was assigned to L Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Division at New River, now Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. In late May 1942, Private Rhodes deployed to New Zealand and soon thereafter took part in the amphibious landings on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the first major American offensive of the war in the Pacific. His unit captured Henderson Field and then endured months of sustained, often brutal combat, including Bloody Ridge and battles now along the Matanikau River. And during this period, Luther became known among his fellow Marines as the Kid and by his nickname, Dusty. He was young and slight, with light blonde hair and a boyish face, but he demonstrated courage and resolve beyond his years. He earned the respect of the men with whom he served. On the night of October 7th, 1942, during the Third Battle of the Matanikau, Japanese forces attempted to break through the Marine lines. In the darkness and the confusion of that engagement, Luther Rhodes was killed in action. He was 18 years old. His fellow Marines recovered his body the following morning. And one of them, Lawrence Hard Rock Gherkin, who had taken Luther under his wing, was informed personally of the young Marine's death. When Gherkin saw Luther's body wrapped in a poncho, he was overcome with grief. He ordered the men carrying him to handle him with care. Decades later, those who witnessed that moment still recalled how Luther's blonde hair appeared alongside the battlefield. But the chaos of the war and the movement of his remains afterwards created lasting uncertainty. Luther's body was buried in a temporary Marine cemetery on Guadalcanal, but his remains were never returned home. In 1949, he was declared permanently non-recoverable. His parents wrote to the Marine Corps in 1946, pleading for information and expressing their hope that their son could one day be returned to the United States for his final resting place. Their youngest son, Marvin, grew up never knowing his brother. Luther died when Marvin was just 6 months old. For decades, Marvin searched for answers. He submitted DNA. He attended briefings. He followed every lead that he could. And eventually, he lost hope that his brother would ever be found. Then, last year, in 2025, the phone rang. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency had identified Luther Rhodes from remains buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Advances in DNA technology had finally made it possible. After 83 years, Luther was coming home. And for the people of Henderson County, that news meant something deep. It meant a son of the mountains who left home as a teenager to serve his country was finally coming back to the hills that raised him. Next weekend, Luther Rhodes will be laid to rest at Edneyville United Methodist Church near his parents and siblings in the soil they prayed he would one day return to, back in the Appalachian Mountains among his own people. That identification came through persistence, careful research, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that no American service member should ever be forgotten. It came through the extraordinary work of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. It came through the advocacy of the Hedrick Rhodes VFW Post 5206 in Hendersonville, and it came through the determination of family members and community leaders who refused to abandon the search. To Marvin Rhodes and the entire Rhodes family, the people of North Carolina honor your brother. We honor your sacrifice, and we are grateful that Luther is finally coming home. Mr. President, I ask that my colleagues join me in honoring Private Luther LaRue Dusty Rhodes, United States Marine Corps, and in reaffirming our commitment to never cease our efforts to account for those who remain missing in action. May God bless the memory of Luther Rhodes, and may God bless the United States of America.
recognize the senator from Hawaii.
Quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Tennessee.
I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had spoken a little bit earlier about what was happening with Homeland Security funding, and one of the things that we are hearing from so many school groups and church groups, people that and families that were coming up for spring break, is their disappointment with these long lines at the airport and difficulty in making those travel arrangements. And again, Mr. President, I think it is so important to encourage our colleagues across the aisle to accept some of the concessions and the offers that have been made to them in order to fully fund DHS and focus on our nation's security. But as I mentioned earlier, they choose not to do that because they want to abolish ICE. And that is their North Star right now. That is their guiding principle. They are all about abolishing ICE. So let's look at what that would mean. One of the things that we have learned from the American people is they wanted to see our nation's border closed. They wanted to make certain that we, the American people, know who is coming into our country and why they are coming into our country. We know that we want to be certain that people are not coming here with ill intent. Now, we have seen this play out. We know for a fact that there are about 18,000 known terrorists that came in during the 4 years of the Joe Biden administration. Many of these people came in with criminal records. We know that they are on these terrorist watch lists. We know that they have moved across our country and that the Department of Homeland Security has been locating these individuals, moving to apprehend these individuals, to detain them, to prosecute them, and to get them out of our country. Now, interestingly enough, the vast majority of the American people agree with that process. They agree that these are individuals that should be removed from the country. And Mr. President, it is really quite amazing to me. In Tennessee, I have not talked to one single person, not one, who says, Marcia, you know what? I hope we get more terrorists moving into our neighborhood. Or, Marcia, I hope we have more gangs, more drug dealers, more drug traffickers, more human traffickers, more sex traffickers, more pedophiles, wanting them in their communities. They don't want that. And there is a good reason for that. The people in this country value public safety. They value that. They want our nation to be safe. They want our communities to be safe. They want to make certain that we are going to have a safe environment in which to live. Public safety, defending our country. That's kind of at the top of the to-do list when you talk with people about their expectations of the activities we're going to take out. There's another thing that is at the top of their to-do list, and that has to do with the Save America Act that is before us right now. This legislation, Mr. President, holds two provisions that the majority of the American people agree with. Democrats give it a 71% thumbs up approval rating. Independents approve it by about 85%, and over 90% of Republicans approve this. And it's really quite simple. It really is common sense. Common sense, obviously, to Democrats all across the country, independents all across the country, Republicans all across the country, but to the Democrats in this chamber, Mr. President, they say, oh, no, 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 don't you don't. The two provisions are this. Number one, if you are going to register to vote in a U.S. election, you have to prove that you are indeed a U.S. citizen. Very common sense. We don't allow people that are not citizens to register to vote because they're not a citizen. Now, if you were to follow the illogic that is on display from many of my colleagues across the aisle, you would hear them say, well, we need to allow these individuals to be a part of the community. Well, you know what? They are illegally in the country. They do not have a right to vote. They should not register to vote. But we've got 19 states, 19 in this country, 19 states that will allow people that are illegally in the country to get a driver's license. Well, what does that have to do with voter registration? Because of the motor voter law, Mr. President, what they will do is get that driver's license, and then they check that little box that says they can register to vote or they want to register to vote. And then the responsibility of getting them off that registration goes to your state registrar of elections, because they're going to have to match up their voter rolls against the list of individuals that are in the country illegally and make certain they're not there. States also can clean up these rolls by making certain that what they're doing is checking it against the IRS Social Security death rolls. This is how you make certain that your rolls are accurate. And that, indeed, is what needs to be done to ensure that people who are eligible to register to vote are the only ones who are registering to vote. Now, there is another thing that can be done to help with making certain that we're respecting citizens, respecting the one person, one vote, and making certain that we are respecting that right to cast that ballot. And that is having individuals who are going to the poll to vote to actually show their ID. Now, in Tennessee, we do this. This is standard process for us in Tennessee. And by the way, we clean up and verify our rolls. We make certain that we are doing that. We check them against the Social Security and the DHS rolls. And we are certain that people are a citizen. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you're going to vote, you got to be a citizen. And when people go to the polls, they take that photo ID and they show that ID before they cast that ballot. Mr. President, this is an action that shows respect. It shows respect for one person, one vote. It shows respect for the process. It shows respect for our citizens. The Save America Act and what it embodies with making certain that people prove they are who they are when they go to that poll, that people prove they are indeed a citizen of this great nation, the greatest nation on the face of the earth, and that they are thereby entitled to register to vote. These are actions that certainly are there to help protect that process. And we want to make certain that the Save America Act is passed, that it makes it to President Trump's desk, and that it is indeed signed into law. And Mr. President, I think that all of our colleagues across the aisle, when you look at the fact that 71% of the Democrats support this, 85% of the independents support this, 90-something% of the Republicans support this. So it leads you to ask the question, what are they afraid of? Well, one of the things that we continue to look at is, as we talk about elections, we should make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And verification, clean rolls, respecting that process, yes, indeed, that is going to make it easier to vote. It's going to make it harder to cheat. That is something that the Save America Act would accomplish. But our colleagues across the aisle are fearful of that. So I would encourage my friends to think long and hard, Mr. President. What are they afraid of with the Save America Act? Are they concerned that it would eliminate fraud? Are they concerned that it would clean up elections? Are they concerned that our counties and states might verify and clean up those voter rolls? Why would they not want to do this? I was doing a telephone town hall with Tennesseans the other night, and we had several thousand on the phone, and a gentleman asked this question, and he said, I don't get this. What are the Democrats afraid of with the Save America Act? And I told him, I said, you know what? I don't get it either. Because if we want to preserve one person, one vote, if we want to make certain we are protecting your right to make certain your vote counts, then these two steps would go a long way to giving individuals the confidence that they want to know that their elections are going to be fair. And in Tennessee, we've been ranked as we're ranked as #1 in election integrity. We go through all these steps, and it would be a wise move for other states to begin through this process. I would encourage these 19 states that don't require you to show identification, or either don't require you to show citizenship, or don't require documentation to register as they're going to vote. I would require them to look very closely at this, to respect the voter, and to make certain their roles are cleared. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
Mr. President.
Senator for California.
Request that we suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Okay. Mr. President, I also ask unanimous consent to use a framed photograph as an exhibit during my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been saying all week, colleagues, that Democrats would be here on the floor fighting this Republican voter suppression bill, this so-called Save America Act, tooth and nail for as long as it takes. And we're keeping that promise because Republicans are trying to pull off this bait and switch for the American people. Let me be clear, this bill is anything but a voter ID bill. If you're a married woman who chose to change her name when she got married, you could be kept from registering to vote under this bill. If this bill were to pass, vote by mail, that option would be gone. No excuse absentee voting, that too would be gone. Your driver's license, which most people think would be sufficient under a voter ID law to access the ballot box, not good enough anymore. Why? It's because the American people are tired and angry about the Donald Trump disastrous agenda, the failures of the Republican majority to improve their lives. And instead of facing the consequences of their actions and owning their record, they want to change the rules of our elections to avoid consequences from the voters. And I can't help but note the timing of this debate. 61 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson came to the Capitol and addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering a powerfully important message to his fellow Americans, a message that is still resonating to this very day. He said, quote, "Rarely are we met with a challenge, not to our growth or abundance, our welfare or our security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation." A challenge to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our nation.
That's a pretty good summary of what's happening this week. President Johnson went on to say, and again I quote, "Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right." End quote. President Johnson was speaking not just to Congress, but to America in the days after Bloody Sunday, when civil rights activists, including former Congressmember John Lewis, when they were violently attacked and beaten crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge as they marched for the right to vote. Now, many of us have treasured memories with John Lewis. And Mr. President, I keep this photo in my office where it inspires me every single day. In the weeks that followed Bloody Sunday, our country and Congress rose to meet the moment. And coming together, Congress passed one of the most significant pieces in our nation's history, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet here we are today, debating a bill that would turn back the clock, that would do so much to deny so many their most fundamental right as Americans, our right to vote. That's shameful. In this country, the right to vote is a sacred thing. After casting our ballots, so many people are so proud to share with their friends, share with the public that they have participated in our democracy. They've done their civic duty. They wear buttons. They wear stickers, which is why we cannot allow these efforts to restrict voter access that are at the heart of this bill. Now, doing so would be an enormous and dangerous step backwards. Under, again, the so-called Save America Act, all 50 states would be required to send their voter rolls, including a lot of private information of voters, to the Department of Homeland Security. I spoke a couple of days ago as to why the Department of Homeland Security is the last entity you would want handling this vital information. Now, once there, known election deniers who have been appointed by the administration would certainly run these lists through the Department of Homeland Security's SAVE program, different kind of SAVE than the name of this bill, the SAVE program, and they would then give back to states lists of names of voters that should be removed from their lists. And colleagues, as you know, a substitute amendment has been filed for the Save America Act that's before us that now forces further reliance on unreliable data from the Social Security Administration. Now, it wasn't that long ago that we discovered that data was being misused by DOJ with a secret agreement to share the data that they got their hands on with outside political groups seeking to overturn election results. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let me be abundantly clear with this point. This is not an accusation. Trump's Department of Justice has admitted to this in court. And here's another admission that the administration has made. Quote, due to misspellings of names, transposed numbers, or incomplete information, the SAVE program may produce inaccurate results. End quote. Again, this is not theoretical. This is not an accusation. It is happening right now. 12 states have chosen or have been politically pressured to cooperate by providing the Trump administration with their voter rolls. And there's been analysis and review of how this demonstration is going. NPR reports that as of December, the information of more than 47 million voters have been run through the SAVE program at DHS. And that means the administration is already flagging American citizens, eligible American voters, to be purged from the rolls. And colleagues, you know what happens when a voter's been purged from the rolls. The burden falls on the voter to undo it, to navigate bureaucracy in order to prove their citizenship once again, and to register to vote once again. But many won't even know there's a problem until they show up on Election Day and they're turned away because even though they've been voting there for years and years and years, all of a sudden, they're not on the list. Texas is one of those 12 states. And again, the review of the activity that's already happening by DHS and this so-called SAVE program, in Travis County, 25% of the flagged names had already proven their citizenship. 1 in 4 voters. And in Boone County, Missouri, another state that's participating, more than half of the voters that DHS told those states to remove were citizens. So let that sink in for a moment. 25 to 50% of the names were flagged in error. 1 in 4 voters? Half of voters? Can you see how this would be a huge problem? Eligible voters being removed from the rolls and even referred to DHS for possible criminal investigation. That's the broken system that Donald Trump wants to use to maintain voter rolls nationwide. And that's the question being posed to the Senate and to Congress. I don't know how Democrats are responding. So the question is really, is this what Republicans want too? And as you look through the rest of the bill, you know that this SAVE program utilization is not the only problem. And we don't have to guess as to what the strict documentation requirements would cause if imposed on the voters. Look no further than the state of Kansas, when they tried something very similar to this just a few years ago. 31,000 eligible citizens blocked from registering to vote. 31,000 eligible citizens blocked in Kansas. If I was a senator from Kansas, I'd be up in arms. Or look to New Hampshire. Hundreds of voters were turned away last year under a recently enacted state law because they didn't have a passport or a birth certificate on hand when they went to the polls. The very types of requirements in the language of the bill before us. Joshua Bogdan was one of those voters. In the late afternoon on Election Day, he turned up at his polling site to vote, only to be turned away because all he had on him was his driver's license that day. He had to race home and frantically search for his passport, then race back to the polls before they closed. Thankfully, he was able to vote that day. But he admitted later that if there was anything that might have delayed him, having to take longer to find the passport, maybe getting caught up in traffic, he would not have been able to cast his vote. He would have been denied his fundamental right to vote. Now, I've also heard some of the sponsors of this bill say, oh, don't worry, if you don't have the proper paperwork at hand, there's going to be a separate process. And they replied to me, well, just read the bill. Well, guess what? I have read the bill. And I'll tell you about this last-minute provision, this last-minute affidavit process that's been inserted into the bill to try to provide cover for those hiding behind the true intent. The fact of the matter is that there's no clear standards for this alternate process that they're pointing to. There's no clear explanation to how it would work. All we do know is that if this bill were to pass and be signed by the president, it would go into effect immediately. So let's be clear about what's fundamentally happening here. Maintaining accurate voter rolls is vital for our elections. It requires precision. It requires transparency. Trust me, I served as California Secretary of State prior to coming to the Senate. Nobody understands this in this body better than I do. But I also understand that that transparency, that precision, is not in this bill. Instead, this bill creates a system where mistakes are inevitable. And if mistakes are inevitable, then it is inevitable that people will be denied their fundamental right to vote. There's a reason, colleagues, that President Johnson and civil rights leaders came to push so hard for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It was to move our country forward, not backward. But this bill, this so-called Save America Act, would be a huge step backwards for our country. Democrats are prepared to meet this challenge. We'll continue opposing this bill. I'll say it again, today, tonight, tomorrow, for as long as it takes. Nothing is more fundamental in our democracy than the right to vote, and we will do everything in our power to protect it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to express my strong opposition to the Save America Act. Let me be clear right off the bat. I believe in protecting the integrity of our elections. I believe our elections should be and are safe and secure. And I believe we must always make sure there is no meddling in our elections. Every eligible American deserves to have their voice heard at the ballot box, and they deserve to have confidence in our democratic system. So this is not a Democrat or Republican value. Free and fair elections are the foundation of the United States of America. And protecting these free and fair elections should be something every elected official should support. But that's not what this bill is really about. It's not what this bill is really about. The hyper-partisan so-called Save America Act, it isn't about making our elections any safer. It's not even about keeping our elections free and fair. It's quite the opposite. This bill is about making it harder for eligible Americans to vote and shrinking the size of our electorate to benefit Republicans. This bill would impose strict restrictions on Americans' ability to vote, restrictions so severe that a woman who gets married and changes her last name could be barred from voting because her last name doesn't match her birth certificate. Think about that. You take your husband's name, now you can't vote because your current last name doesn't match your birth certificate. You know, you see Donald Trump and Washington Republicans, they're so afraid of being held accountable for their actions and their jobs and what they're doing, that they're trying anything that they can possibly do to prevent people from voting in order to increase their odds in this year's midterm elections. They know their actions to raise gas prices, cut your health care, increase costs for illegal tariffs, groceries up, rent up, utilities up. They are not popular with the American people. And that's why Trump first tried to rig congressional maps in red states like Texas and Missouri to give Republicans an advantage. And when that didn't work, Washington Republicans, well, they decided to push a hyper-partisan bill. You heard me right. Instead of working to improve your lives, to improve lives of Americans by lowering costs at the kitchen table, by expanding access to health care, and face the voters on the merits of their work, they would just rather restrict the electorate. In other words, they just want to stop people from voting. And at a time when families are struggling, we're struggling to make ends meet, when people are being squeezed by rising prices at the grocery store, now at the gas pump going higher and higher every day, well, and at the doctor's office, if you still have insurance. Washington Republicans have chosen to focus all of their efforts, every single one of them, on preventing people from voting. Washington Republicans not lowering your costs. They're not helping working families get ahead. Instead, they're making it harder for Americans to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So let's not kid ourselves here. Washington Republicans are using this totally unnecessary and harmful bill, well, as a distraction. A distraction from the fact that families are struggling to keep up with the rising costs of their lives. A distraction from the fact that gas prices are going up every single day. A distraction that groceries are more expensive, and they're going up every single day, along with the price of gas. It's a distraction from the fact that too many Americans are just worried about how they're going to afford their health care and their medication, and what tough choices they may have to make in order to make ends meet. And these are the things that really keep people up at night, and these are the things that the Senate should be focused on. And so Trump and Washington Republicans have done absolutely nothing to lower the price of your groceries or your gas, and nothing to make sure that your health care is more affordable. Washington Republicans simply don't care about your monthly bills going up and up. Instead, we're debating a bill that does absolutely nothing to make life more affordable for anyone. So what should we be doing? We should be working together to protect against real threats to our elections, like foreign interference, voter intimidation, and making sure that every legal vote is counted, not creating new obstacles for Americans who are simply trying to exercise their constitutional right to vote. We should be working together to address real threats and the real challenges that American families are facing today. I said, taking care of your family, kids going to school, rent, groceries, utilities, opportunity. We should be working together to address those financial pressures that families are under, to come up with the good solutions, good policies that will actually make a real difference for people in their lives at their kitchen table. And that's really what we've been elected to do. And so we owe it to the voters to do that, and we also owe it to the voters to protect their right to vote in future elections. So to be clear, I will not support policies that make it harder for eligible Americans to vote. And so I urge my colleagues to reject the Save America Act and get back to focusing on what actually matters to the American people, lowering everyday costs, making life more affordable, and a good future more attainable. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Ms. Elsa Brooks.
I'm good.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to read excerpts of a letter March 17th to Senators Collins and Britt from the border czar and the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Trump administration. And I won't read the whole thing, except to point out that there are 5 substantive areas in which the administration expressed a willingness to enact reforms. Now, that sounds kind of encouraging, but I want to read the 5 points. I'll summarize. The first is we will expand the use of body-worn cameras by DHS law enforcement undertaking immigration enforcement operations. Fine. Let's codify that. I think the retention of data is important. I think the last time we talked about body-worn cameras, there was a willingness to fund body-worn cameras. There was a willingness to indicate that it was the policy that people should wear body-worn cameras, but there was not yet a willingness to codify that requirement in federal law. But that's workable. The second thing is the administration will limit civil immigration enforcement activities at certain sensitive locations, like hospitals and schools, There are more sensitive locations than hospitals and schools. Churches, synagogues, mosques, polling locations. There are multiple sensitive locations where we've just decided until now, as a society, that that is not a good place for law enforcement, especially a roving patrol, to be. The government should not be in a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a temple. The government should not be in a hospital conducting immigration enforcement. The government should not be in a polling location or near a polling location conducting immigration enforcement. And so the idea of limiting civil immigration enforcement activities at certain sensitive locations is a reasonable start. However, I would like to rule out all of the sensitive locations and not just say like hospitals and schools. Now here's where it gets a little like those are fine. That's workable, that's negotiable. I want to take you through the next 3 bullet points. This is the 3rd bullet point, starts with the administration will adhere to current law that affords Congress oversight of DHS detention facilities. It's literally saying, we got 5 concessions we're willing to make, and one of them is to adhere to current law. What in the hell is happening to this country where it is a concession from one political party to the other to adhere to federal statutory law? That is not a concession. That is not something we have to negotiate for. That is not a show of good faith. It's also a concession that they were not adhering to current law until now. This is an offer. We offer that we're going to follow the law. The 4th point is the administration will enforce the use of visible officer identification. I think that's also referring to a current federal statute. And by the way, the question of masks is a little sticky. There's no question in my mind that masks are being overused, and there's no reason that ICE officers and ICE officers alone all have to not reveal their face, their badge number, even what agency they work for. The reason people trust their local police department is because when something happens, you see the face, hello, I'm Officer so-and-so, how can I be useful? There are some very narrow circumstances, an undercover operation, or if an agent has been doxxed, where you may want to protect their privacy, but that is not the norm, and it has become the norm within ICE. And here's the final bullet point. The administration will adhere to existing law and practice of not deporting any U.S. citizens That's a concession. We're not going to deport any U.S. citizens in violation of federal law. That's a give to us. That's not a give to anybody. That's the federal law. And this was what was sent as a, look, we're working on it. And so all of this is to say, we're not that close to a deal on ICE. It's not that discussions are not ongoing. It's not that there aren't people of good faith trying to figure out how to both fund this agency and reform this agency. Those conversations are going on, but there's not a serious person in this building who thinks a deal is imminent. There is not an imminent deal. By the way, even if we had conceptual agreement, it takes time to draft legislative text, vet legislative text, get House and Senate Republicans and Democrats and the White House on board. We're not that close. And in the meantime, TSA workers are not getting paid. And in the meantime, the Coast Guard has experienced a lapse in appropriations. And in the meantime, FEMA has a lapse in appropriations. And in the meantime, CISA, which does our cybersecurity in the middle of a war, has a lapse in appropriations. And so all I am asking, all we are asking, is release the hostages. These government agencies did nothing to deserve being defunded. And by the way, that's exactly what we did about 6 weeks ago, is we decided we're just not in agreement about DHS, and so let's fund the rest of the government. 96% of the government is now funded. We funded the Department of Defense, we funded the State Department, we funded the National Institutes of Health, we funded the Centers for Disease Control, we funded the Department of Energy, the Department of Interior. We funded all of those departments because they have nothing to do with the current debate. And so what I'm saying is, we're not there yet on ICE, but why in the heck would we punish TSA? Why in the heck would we punish the Coast Guard? Why would we do that? And so I am completely flabbergasted at the position of the Republicans. And I respect the person who's about to object, and we're going to engage in all of this. But let's just be really clear what their position is they won't fund TSA. They won't fund Coast Guard. They won't fund FEMA. They won't fund cybersecurity unless we attach ICE to it. Let's just be adults, continue our negotiation about ICE, and release the hostages. These are American citizens working for the government, working for the public, without a paycheck, and we could solve this right this moment. And so I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of the Murray bill that is at the desk, that the bill be considered read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, thank you. My friend from Hawaii makes a great case in a lot of areas, and he's correct. This has been incredibly frustrating for TSA, for Coast Guard, for so many other folks that are national security professionals. DHS has 250,000 federal employees, 250,000. ICE has 20,000 of that 250,000. And the argument has been about those 20,000 somewhat, but the problem is those 20,000 also do a pretty vital job for the country. Let me give you an example. Homeland Security investigators are part of ICE. Those Homeland Security investigators are the federal agents that actually investigate human trafficking. They're the federal agents that do drug smuggling across the border. Homeland Security investigators are the investigators that actually prohibit American arms sales going out of the country to foreign nationals. These individuals are very important to us. Now, a fraction of ICE is what they call ERO, that's actually doing the arrests here, but a large portion of ICE, of those 20,000 folks, are actually doing a lot of our drug smuggling, human trafficking, arms trafficking, all those functions as well. So to be able to say I'm defunding ICE is one thing, but you're also defunding all those federal entities that are Homeland Security entities on it as well. That's our challenge in this. And As I've said to my colleagues before, when they defund ICE, at what point does it ever turn back on? At what point did I ever come back to my Democratic colleagues and say, it's time to actually fund ICE? The pressure from the hard left outside has been so focused on defunding ICE, defunding ICE, defunding ICE, that's going to make it very, very difficult for any of my colleagues to ever vote and say they're going to do this. Now, as far as the negotiation process, my colleague from Hawaii is correct. There have been some letters that have been exchanged. Part of my frustration, and I've shared it with him before, is that the offer that he was dictating was actually made, and there was no response that came back for 18 days. So the offer was made to say, let's talk about this. Here's a proposal. 18 days later, there was a response. We lost 2.5 weeks of time in negotiation to be able to do it. Now, thankfully, it has moved past just that letter now. There's actually legislative language. That language is being debated behind closed doors now, finally, to be able to talk about it. There have been Democratic members that are meeting with the White House and with Republican members here in the Senate to be able to go more in depth, to be able to figure out what to do. It is de-escalation training. Yes, it is definitely body-worn cameras and including how they're going to be used and trying to be able to mandate those. It's identification for officers. It's when they step out of their vehicle to identify who they are, to be able to track that. It's a lot of the aspects that have been discussed, including the warrant issue, that my Democratic colleagues have said it's really important. We want to be able to deal with the warrant issue as well. All those things are in current negotiation around legislative language. Last week, I stood here and said, why aren't we staying through the weekend to be able to work to solve this? Why are we leaving and going home? We should stay at the wheel and keep working until it's actually resolved. Not just for the 250,000 folks that are in DHS, but also for those 20,000 folks that also work with ICE. They have families as well. They have mortgages as well. They also want to be able to get paid the same as everybody else. So the challenge now becomes, we're not going to just defund ICE and then never turn it back on so ICE agents quit because they know they're not getting paid and it just drags on for a long time. We need to actually resolve the differences. My colleague and I agree on body-worn cameras. We agree on de-escalation. Now, we disagree somewhat on the mask issue because the problem has become unique. There's now activists who have apps that they're snapping pictures and saying there's an ICE agent here. They're snapping a picture of their vehicle. They're putting it together. And other people are then snapping where they are, tracking, using facial recognition to be able to identify where their family is. Where ICE agents, for the first time that I know of ever, now literally put their family at risk from Americans. In the past, ICE agents knew that there were cartels that were pursuing them. Now it's not just cartels, it's left-wing activists that are now trying to snap a picture of them. And so while they're in one city, you can actually have an activist show up at their hometown, at their home address, and to be able to torment their family there. For the sake of the ICE agent and for their kids, why would we not allow them to be able to protect themselves and to be able to protect their family? They're doing a job that the federal government has asked them to do, to go pick up criminals and to go pick up criminal aliens. Let's protect their family in the process of actually doing that. So I do object to this, but I'd love to be able to offer a second alternative to this in the days ahead, so I object.
Mr. President, first of all, I didn't get a chance to thank the senator from Oklahoma for keeping the Senate last week. There was a moment where there was an exchange of views, and it was actually the majority leader had a perfect right to kind of monopolize the time and make it so that it would have been 6 Republicans in a row and we would have been just standing there. But he's the one that said, look, it's the Senate, we have to have a debate, and caused us to take turns. That seems like a small thing, but it's not a small thing, because we ought to be hard on the issues and easy on each other. And I just appreciate his steadfastness in being decent while being extremely conservative at the same time. I'll just make a couple of final points. On HSI in particular, I think a lot of us would feel more comfortable carving that out, if it weren't for the fact that so many of these HSI people are actually being taken off of their current assignment to help conduct immigration enforcement. And so people are literally being taken off of like preventing child pornography, preventing arms trafficking and drug smuggling, and they're now in these immigration enforcement actions. 300 remain in Minnesota. And so there's a little bit of the devil being in the details as it relates to getting our arms around this, because we don't want whatever we do to only apply to the narrow question of the appropriations bill. For instance, when members said, I have a right under the appropriations law to go and visit this detention center, the people at the detention center who turned away members of Congress said, we're not funded by the appropriations bill, we're funded by the OBBA. Different pot of money, different set of rules that attach. And so whatever agreement that we achieve, if we achieve one, we can't mess around with color of money and detailees from HSI or CBP. Like, as these operations manifest themselves on the ground, nobody's tracking what the color of money is. So all of the reforms that we're talking about have to attach to OBBA money, have to attach to detailees from either the FBI or HSI or any other federal law enforcement agency. We are trying to actually get this agency under control. But my basic problem is, this is cordial, this is constructive, but you and I both know we're not that close, and people got to make their rent and their mortgage now. And so the idea that nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to, like, sounds good in diplomacy, but the practical effect is that our Coast Guardsmen and women, our TSA, our FEMA employees, our CISA employees are going to miss paychecks because we're still in an argument about a very, very narrow swath of the federal government. I yield the floor.
To recognize the senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, my friend from Hawaii is absolutely correct on the color of money issue. There shouldn't be a difference. Those are taxpayer dollars, all of them. So the taxpayers should have accountability in that, and there shouldn't be a limitation on that. And that is one of the areas that I've also expressed frustration at DHS on, because I'm also one of those folks that's made a call, said I want to make a quick drop-in on one of the DHS detention facilities to be able to see it, and I was also told no. That should not be so. So I agree with my colleague from Hawaii on that, that whatever rules apply should apply no matter what account that it comes from, because the account is actually the American taxpayer. So that should apply in every single spot on that. I do agree as well that we've got to be able to finish this out. We've tried to offer several opportunities to be able to do it. Want to continue to be able to do that as well. At the very beginning of this, we couldn't reach an agreement, so we did what was called a continuing resolution. Say, let's pay everybody short term until we can actually get through this. That's how we started this. That actually ended, and now we don't have anything on it as well. So I'd like to offer a 4-week version of that, to say for the next month, let's try to work through this. I think we're closer. That's my opinion on this. I think we're closer to the debate to be able to getting this done. But if it's my family trying to be able to get to a paycheck, they just want to know it's going to get done. So I'd like to offer a simple amendment, that is to take DHS funding, do a continuing resolution for the next month, and to be able to have it all funded. Let's keep debating, let's keep working this out, but make sure that everybody gets paid. So I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 156 HR 4553. I further ask that the substitute amendment at the desk be considered, agreed to, the bill as amended be considered, read a third time, passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered, made, laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I'll be brief. I always enjoy our exchanges, and this one was, I think, particularly constructive on substance. I'll just say, my job is to count, and the votes do not exist for what the senator from Oklahoma is asking for. They just don't exist. Not if I wanted it, not if Senator Schumer wanted it. The votes are not there, and I think that one of the things that I've tried to convey to my Republican colleagues is the depth of feeling, not because there's some group demanding that we be tough on this, but because American citizens have been deported, American citizens have been killed at the hands of this agency. It doesn't mean everybody in this agency is not trying their best. It does mean that this agency is in desperate need of reform, and we do not have the votes to extend funding for this agency without reforms, whether it's 1 day, 1 month, or 1 year. I yield the floor. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Recognize the senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to address two issues. The first is the funding of DHS, and the second will be on the Save America Act. I actually agree with the senator from Hawaii. I don't think we're close. And here's why. The Democrats have made it very clear they're hell-bent on defunding ICE. They have demonized these husbands, wives, cousins, sisters, brothers, to the point where they have painted themselves into a corner where there is nothing that they will accept short of eliminating immigration enforcement in this country. The White House has acted in good faith with the Democrats on this, with some reasonable measures like more training, body cams, things like that. But here's what they really want. What they really want is they don't want people deported. They don't actually believe in the sovereignty of the United States of America. They don't think that as a country we should decide who's here and who has to go. It's a fundamental disagreement that didn't exist before. If you listen to a Bill Clinton speech from not that long ago, he talked about strong borders and deporting people. Barack Obama deported millions of people. What they want is a dynamic, and if you listen closely, the reason why they want mask agents or the ICE agents not to wear masks is they want them identified. They want the ICE agents' families to be terrorized. They want the facial recognition software that exists on Facebook and others when people are doxxed to be very clear and usable so that nobody wants to join ICE anymore. This is the exact same phenomenon that happened with the Defund the Police movement. What happened was because the police officers were demonized by the left, people retired early. People stopped joining police departments. Recruitment dived. That's what they want with ICE. They want to muck up the process with this whole idea of judicial warrants, knowing full well that warrants currently exist right now. There's a full disposition for deportation through the process that both Republicans and Democrats have agreed to over the years, including Republicans and Democrat presidents. That's not good enough because they want to make it harder to deport people. So this fundamental question about whether or not we're going to get funding for DHS is going to be very hard to solve when the Democrats on the other side don't actually want to solve the problem. And Chuck Schumer wants the chaos. I've talked to rank and file Democrats who have no idea about the reasonable nature of what the White House has offered because the minority leader doesn't want them to know because this is what he wants. He wants the chaos. He wants people stranded on spring break at airports because he creates a bigger problem and he thinks that all goes back to Trump. This is not like rocket science, but it's dirty. And what the Republicans have said is the White House is dealing in good faith. These people deserve to be paid. We shouldn't be holding all these people hostage. These TSA agents who are now going to miss their third paycheck here pretty soon. Listen, I fly back and forth every week. People can't afford that. Real people can't do that. So this is where we're at. I think they want to create a dynamic like they did with the Defund the Police movement that they were so supportive of a decade ago with the Defund ICE movement, so that they can't do their jobs, and their jobs become so difficult and their families are terrorized that nobody wants to be at ICE anymore. And then what do you have? You have amnesty for the 15 million people who are here illegally, the de facto amnesty because they're not going to be deported. That's the truth. Now, they're not going to say it on the Senate floor, but that's really what's going on. And so, as far as I'm concerned, we're not going to do anything that kneecaps ICE's ability to do their jobs. The American people, this was on the ballot, they support deportations. They don't think that rapists and murderers who are here in this country are more important, illegally, are more important than American wives and daughters. So that's the dynamic. Mr. President, I also point out, as we talk about the Save America Act, the graveyards of history are littered with the bones of once great republics that chose to die. Not because foreign armies stormed their gates in a single dramatic assault, but because their own leaders slowly, deliberately, and cowardly surrendered the thing that made them nations in the first place. Rome didn't fall in a day. Constantinople didn't collapse overnight. They died by 1,000 small surrenders, each one dressed up as compassion, progress, or decency, until there was nothing left worth defending. Mr. President, today this Senate stands at the same crossroads. Great republics don't die by accident. They commit suicide. And the suicide always begins when the ruling class loses the moral courage to defend citizenship, truth, and the innocence of the next generation. The Save America Act before us is not 3 unrelated titles. It's one urgent existential question. Will America still have the will to live? Or do we join the long list of civilizations that quietly chose decline? Yesterday, I answered the Democrats' lies with the actual text of the bill. Today, I rise to warn the body. We're watching a nation decide whether or not it chooses to exist. It won't happen overnight, but over time, this is what happens. First comes the surrender of citizenship itself, and that's Title I of the substitute that I've offered, Save American Voters. We just endured 4 years of the wildest open border in American history. Millions and millions and millions and millions of military-aged men from 160 different countries flooded into this nation while Democrats cheered diversity and equity. Now those same Democrats have the audacity to claim that simply asking people to prove that they're American citizens before they register to vote is somehow voter suppression. Let me translate what they're really saying. They want those people who came here illegally to vote for them to suppress the vote of actual Americans. They fear actual American citizens voting more than they fear the fraud. American elections are for Americans, and we need safeguards. When I was Missouri's Attorney General, I stood in court and fought the left's dark money lawyers to defend these very safeguards. Missouri fought back. We didn't settle. We fought back and we won. The American people deserve that same victory here. Because when citizenship becomes optional at the ballot box, the republic itself becomes optional. Next comes the surrender of truth, Title II of the Save America Sports provision of this underlying substitute. A civilization that lies about something as basic as the difference between men and women has already begun a death spiral. Title II simply says what every normal American already knows. Women's and girls' sports are for women and girls. Biological males cannot declare themselves women and steal scholarships, records, locker rooms, and safety from actual females. We have watched this fraud unfold in real time. Boys with superior strength and bone density dominating girls' competitions while the ruling class calls it inclusion. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this progress? While they sip champagne at their cocktail parties. That is theft. That is cruelty. It is the law conscripted into service of a lie. I have 2 daughters in Missouri who love sports. They should never, ever be forced to surrender